Greetings and welcome. We are in Junior English, and we are now interested in flowing 3 lectures by a very famous lecturer from Brown University. Dr. Weinstein will be talking to you now about Ralph Waldo Emerson. Flowing, just taking notes, putting information that he has to say in your own words, the best that you can. All right, try and stay focused. We'll be listening to 3 lectures right in a row. Here we go.
This is lecture 4, and it's the first of 3 lectures on Emerson, and it's going to be followed by 3 lectures on Thoreau. Now, we usually think of Emerson and Thoreau as the great duo for what is called American Transcendentalism. And in my opinion, that term is an unfortunate term, even though it has its truth, because it connotes, I think, a kind of arid, boring, pontificating body of tenets that belongs as much to the church as it really does to literature. And there's a lot of truth in that. Emerson does pontificate, and Emerson was in the church. But what that term misses, and what I think needs to be restored to our understanding of transcendentalism and to Emerson and to Thoreau, is the extraordinary beauty and quickness of their language, that these are our romantic poets. That Emerson and Thoreau are Yankee versions of what England has in Wordsworth and Keats and Shelley. And that it's a claim that I'd like to try to substantiate by really looking carefully at the language of Emerson's essays. I'll quote a lot because Emerson is a spellbinding writer. His words, his images, his metaphors grab us, and they make us think differently about the issues that he's talking about, which is, of course, really what he has in mind. When we think of these figures, Ralph Waldo Emerson, and the whole slew of mid and late 19th century American writers, Henry, Wadsworth, Longfellow, something mellifluous here. They're all 3 names, they all sort of roll off the tongue: James Russell Lowell, Oliver Wendell Holmes, William Jennings Bryan. There's something, it seems to me, a bit pompous, inflated, museum pieces. What vitality or excitement could they have for us? And that too is a reason for taking a good look at Emerson, settling in, chewing a bit on his language, on his ideas. He's the great guiding light, it seems to me, of American literature. He's not the first figure in our course. Certainly there are American writers and writers producing literature in this country before it's called America, such as Franklin, Washington Irving. But Emerson is the moment, I think, where American literature becomes American. And in our sequence of lectures on Emerson, we're going to try to pay attention to several facets of his work. We'll pay attention to the particular essays that he wrote in the 3rd and 4th decades of the 19th century. The first lecture is going to be devoted predominantly to Emerson's views on language, which will lead us to an understanding of Emerson's seminal role on American poetry. Emerson is really the entry to Walt Whitman. He articulates the ideas about poetry that Whitman is later going to actualize. Emerson is most known for his great essay called Self-Reliance. And if he's not known for it, we certainly know that the idea is a central tenet in American values. Important when Emerson stated these beliefs, knew them, and every bit as much with us today. It's sort of synonymous with what's American. It's an essay, however, that is much more complex, provocative, destabilizing than we ordinarily think. And I'll close with a lecture on Emerson's later essay. It's not really the end of his career, but more mature essays, in particular an essay called Experience, where Emerson appears to have gone full circle and begins to raise a series of questions about notions of self, of reliance, of identity, that will be puzzling to us and that are very much in keeping with some of the most modern contemporary ideas about identity as something that is constructed, not something that is innate, or about consciousness, subjectivity itself being made up of things that are outside in the culture and not simply inhering within us. So there's a range in Emerson's work, and it's a range that I think is rewarding when one looks at it. It doesn't cancel out the earlier positions, but it adds a certain amount of depth to them, and in a sense, it problematizes them. No one looking at Emerson's beginnings would have thought that this would be the great sort of visionary writer in the American tradition, that he would lay down the key notions about self, about our relation to nature, about the need for creating a new kind of language and literature. You wouldn't have thought that. He was a middling student. He went to Harvard, but that wasn't quite as difficult to get into then as it is today. His health was not great. He nonetheless went to Harvard Divinity School after he graduated from the college in 1821. And he marries early. He marries a woman, Ellen Tucker, who is ill with tuberculosis. As I said, his own health was poor. She dies in 1831, and there is a feeling that this is his first encounter with tragedy, with death, loss. And it happens at a time when he is beginning to rethink a number of key ideas in his own formation. And in particular, he resigns the ministry in 1832, predominantly because he has grave questions about the sacraments, about conducting communion, and feels that he's no longer able to fully believe in this or to do this. And at that point, Emerson goes to Europe, and he meets in England a host of terribly important writers. John Stuart Mill, he meets Coleridge, he meets Wordsworth, and he meets Thomas Carlyle, whose sort of brand of sort of fiery enthusiasm and iconoclasm much appeals to him. He then moves back to the United States, and he moves to Concord, and he begins to give his famous lectures. Famous then, famous now. People have written about what it was like to hear this man talk. He was spellbinding, hypnotic. They didn't always understand. They often didn't understand. People of serious intellect said afterwards, I was absolutely mesmerized listening to him, but I don't really think I understood a word he said. And they didn't mean that as criticism. They felt like there was a kind of higher logic being expressed here, something that grabbed them, that was not easy to spell out in the kind of discursive terms people were used to. He publishes in 1836 his breakthrough first text, which is Nature. It's an appropriate term for it. And this is the text where Emerson fully breaks with the past and announces a new regime. I'll read you the first lines of Nature. Our age is retrospective. It builds the sepulchres of the fathers. It writes biographies, histories, and criticism. The foregoing generations beheld God and nature face to face, we through their eyes. Why should not we also enjoy an original relation to the universe? Why should not we have the poetry and philosophy of insight and not of tradition? And a religion by revelation to us, and not the history of theirs. Embosomed, and listen to the language here, embosomed for a season in nature, whose floods of life stream around and through us, and invite us by the powers they supply to action proportioned to nature. Why should we grope among the dry bones of the past, or put the living generation into masquerade out of its faded wardrobe? The sun shines today also. There's more wool and flax in the fields. There are new lands, new men, new thoughts. Let us demand our own works and laws and worship. So this is a kind of clarion call. It's a trumpet blast. It says, we need to create our own culture. And Emerson proclaims a kind of remarkable fusion with the natural world. And one of his most famous, infamous really, references, He describes himself as a transparent eyeball. There's actually a cartoon at the time which lampoons him and shows him as some huge eyeball. Standing on the bare ground, my head bathed by the blithe air, and uplifted into infinite space, all mean egotism vanishes. I become a transparent eyeball. I am nothing. I see all. The currents of the universal being circulate through me. I am part or particle of God. Now, this vision, this experience, requires a particular kind of language to make it happen. And in this first publication, Nature, Emerson lays down some remarkable principles about language. And in particular, he sounds like a theorist. He sounds like a linguist, and he sounds like a modern linguist. Here, and he numbers them, 1, 2, 3. Here's 3 principles. Words are signs of natural facts. This is the beginning of American semiotics. Words are signs of natural facts. Particular natural facts are symbols of particular spiritual facts. Nature is the symbol of spirit. Can you see the dance that's involved there, the traffic that's involved in these notions? Everything signals to, is a conduit for something else. Words are not just linguistic codes or notations. They are the signs of natural facts. They send us back to the world of nature. But that the world of nature is not simply phenomenal, material. It is also spiritual.
The second box.
Because natural facts are symbols of spiritual facts. And nature is the symbol of spirit. And Emerson illustrates this model by doing a certain amount of etymology. He explains that the words that we have all derive back from physical properties. He says right means straight, wrong means twisted. Spirit primarily means wind, transgression, the crossing of a line, supercilious, the raising of the eyebrow. And he talks about our consistent use of metaphor here. We say the heart to express emotion, the head to denote thought. So that we are always on the move in Emerson's work. He wants us to understand the fluidity here. Sometimes he moves towards what looks like a search for original language, and this has its own politics. For example, he writes that if we want to find really vivid language, we go back to people who are not cultured or cultivated. It's this, I quote, which gives that piquancy to the conversation of the strong-natured farmer or backwoodsman, which all men relish. And he adds, these facts may suggest the advantage which country life possesses for a powerful mind over the artificial and curtailed life of cities. This is an article of romantic thinking. Is that you go into nature, you find the people who live in nature, and lo and behold, their very language is going to be closer to these material and spiritual origins that are so important to him, that he wants to make more visible. There's also a view of power, and that's one of the most exciting features in Emerson's work. That if we use the right language, if we learn how to speak right and learn how to see right, learn how to think right, we find ourselves initiated into an extraordinary power system. It's the power that flows through nature. It's, in a sense, a way of accessing the enormity of forces that otherwise we seem to have lost sight of. I quote again, we're thus assisted by natural objects in the expression of particular meanings. But how great a language to convey such peppercorn informations! Did it need such noble races of creatures, this profusion of forms, this host of orbs in heaven, to furnish man with the dictionary and grammar of his municipal speech? Whilst we use this grand cipher to expedite the affairs of our pot and kettle, we feel that we have not yet put it to its use, neither are able, and here comes this really beautiful phrase, we are like travelers using the cinders of a volcano to roast their eggs. That here is this remarkable machinery, this great powerful engine, which is nature, which is the physical world, and we're using it for the most reductive purposes. We haven't yet seen its power and its majesty. Tapping into power, then, is going to be a kind of lifelong concern of Emerson. And so he regards writers as people who have always been interested in doing that. And he actually says that the writer, not just the literary writer, but the philosopher, the oracle, is someone who has always, in Emerson's words, sat at the feet of the Sphinx. He says, there sits the Sphinx at the roadside, and from age to age, as each prophet goes by, he tries his fortune at reading her riddle. The Sphinx is there, the great mystery is there, the conduit of power is there. And the challenge is for us to be able to read it, to decode it, to make it somehow accessible to our own people, to our own peers. It's in keeping with the same linguistics. He ends up by saying, a fact is the end or last issue of spirit. A fact is the end or last issue of spirit. The things are not just things. They're the culmination of an entire spiritual process. Open up facts, then, is the great requirement here. Open up facts. Open up this material world and see the spiritual wonders that are in it. All that Adam had, all that Caesar could, you have and can do. Adam called his house heaven and earth. Caesar called his house Rome. You perhaps call yours the cobbler's trade, 100 acres of plowed land, or scholar's garret. Yet, line for line, and point for point, your dominion is as great as theirs, though without fine names. There's a kind of emancipating goal here, a liberating goal here. Come into your estate. Recognize that what you're doing is your estate, that it has grandeur, it has scope beyond anything that you have dreamed of. So, as I said, this was a clarion call, this essay, Nature. Young people read this and said, this is magnificent. This is a kind of stupendous opening. Older people read this and were not happy. That this was a very subversive kind of talk. The real subversive talk is the one that Emerson gave the next year at Harvard. He gave the Phi Beta Kappa oration in 1837, and this talk has now come down to us as the American scholar. Emerson was not invited back to Harvard for 29 years after giving this talk. But imagine how young people in 1837 heard this. Emerson tells it straight about what's wrong with the United States in terms of culture. He's talking about the literary achievements of a country that's very enterprising and bustling on the material front. And he says, thus far, our holiday has been simply a friendly sign of the survival of the love of letters amongst the people too busy to give to letters anymore. Like, literature's not dead, it's survived, but nothing's happening. Perhaps the time has already come when it ought to be and will be something else, when the sluggard intellect of this continent will look from under its iron lids and fill the postponed expectation of the world with something better than the exertions of mechanical skill. Our day of independence, our long apprenticeship to the learning of other lands, draws to a close. That millions that are around us rushing into life cannot always be fed on the sere remains of foreign harvests. Events, actions arise that must be sung, that will sing themselves. And so, in this speech, Emerson begins to spell out the need for there to be an indigenous American idiom, an indigenous American message. And this speech is rich in other implications as well. It's also a speech that has strangely implications that are almost Marxist in terms of his critique of the division of labor, of the smallness of the lives that Americans lead. Man is not a farmer or professor or an engineer, but he is all. Man is priest and scholar and statesman and producer and soldier. And he goes on to say that in our current scheme, we have somehow been reduced to the particular role that we play, rather than realizing that this is just a part of our large repertory. Man is thus metamorphosed into a thing, into many things. The planter, who is man sent out into the field to gather food, is seldom cheered by any idea of the true dignity of his ministry. And he goes through other professions that people have, and it's the same kind of critique that Marx is doing just a little bit later, that labor has become mechanical, that people have lost the sense of the worth or dignity or scope or ultimate meaning of their own work. Emerson is making a comparable argument here. Emerson also, and here I think the people at Harvard were uncomfortable, puts down scholarship. He says, meek young men grow up in libraries. This is given at Harvard. Meek young men grow up at libraries, believing it their duty to accept the views which Cicero, which Locke, which Bacon have given, forgetful that Cicero, Locke, and Bacon were only young men in libraries when they wrote these books. Get out of the libraries. Use the writers, but get out of the libraries and do your work. Embrace the present. In a remarkable sequence, Emerson acknowledges that his is an age of introversion, introspection, and he asks, should that be evil? Should that be a restraint? He cites Hamlet, sicklied o'er with the pale cast of thought, that we seem to be locked into subjectivity. Is this so bad then? The response he gives is, let us move into our own land, our own culture. Let us get beyond this introspective cast. The literature of the poor, the feelings of the child, the philosophy of the street, the meaning of household life are the topics of the time. It is a great stride. He says, why do we spend our time copying the models of the past? I ask not for the great, the remote, the romantic. What is doing in Italy or Arabia? What is Greek art or Provençal minstrelsy? I embrace the common. I explore and sit at the feet of the familiar, the low. Give me insight into today, and you may have the antique and future worlds. What would we really know the meaning of? The meal in the firkin, the milk in the pan, the ballad in the street, the news of the boat, the glance of the eye, the form and the gait of the body. Emerson then lays down the laws for a new kind of writing. And writing in America, by and large, prior to that, was modeled on European codes, on a class system as well that fits into the European model, which deals with kings and queens and divinities. All of this is to be rejected for a frank but excited view of our own new democratic society. And Emerson has a very exalted view of poetry itself, that poetry should be not an elitist art form, but a form that brings us into the riches that we ourselves can lay claim to. He says the poet is representative, and it's a word that Emerson likes to use, representative. One of his great series is called Representative Men. What does he mean by it? He stands among partial men for the complete man, and listen to this very beautiful phrase, and apprises us not of his wealth, but of the commonwealth. All the greatness that you see in Shakespeare and in Dante and in Sophocles is your greatness. This isn't their genius only. It allows you to tap into it and therefore to lay claim to it. This is what expands your estate. And so America then becomes a place where this kind of greatness has to be seen, which means we have to rethink what kind of literature we have. Poetry is not just an affair of rhyme verse. It's not meters, he says, but a meter-making argument that makes a poem. And he wants a language, he says, that is vehicular, that moves people, that promotes this commerce between words and things and spirit. And he wants a poet, he calls for a poet of the future, and these lines read so strangely as we read them a century and a half later. because it is an absolute call to Walt Whitman. I look in vain for the poet whom I describe. We do not, with sufficient plainness or sufficient profoundness, address ourselves to life, nor dare we chant our own times and social circumstance. We have yet had no genius in America, with tyrannous eye, who knew the value of our incomparable materials, and saw in the barbarism and materialism of the times another carnival of the same gods whose picture he so much admires in Homer, then in the Middle Ages, then in Calvinism. And here, this next line is perfect Emerson, and it's going to be perfect Whitman. Banks and tariffs, the newspaper and caucus, Methodism and Unitarianism are flat and dull to dull people, but rest on the same foundations of wonder as the town of Troy and the temple of Delphos, and are as swiftly passing away. Our log rolling, our stumps, these are the homely particulars of American life in the 1830s. Our politics, our fisheries, our Negroes, our Indians, our boasts, our repudiations, the wrath of rogues, the pusillanimity of honest men, the northern trade, the southern planting. Here's Whitman's program. The western clearing, Oregon, Texas, are yet unsung. Yet America is a poem in our eyes. Whitman will repeat exactly those lines. Its ample geography dazzles the imagination and will not wait long for meters. And it didn't have to wait long for meters. This is the poet of the future who's being called here. Whitman actually said, I was simmering, and Emerson brought me to a boil. And I think that we can understand that when we look at these prophetic lines. I'd like to begin closing this talk by referring to an essay called History. And he furthers the view of moving into our estate, of finally taking proper ownership of what is ours. There's one mind common to all individual men, he says. Every man is an inlet to the same and to all of the same. He that is once admitted to the right of reason is made a free man of the whole estate. What Plato has thought, he may think. What a saint has felt, he may feel. What at any time has befallen any man, he can understand. And it's that sense of a grand program, of becoming heir to all of the tradition, but seeing it as it plays in the United States, in America, in this new democratic culture. That's what he calls for. That's what he fails to see around him. He actually uses the term, our actual knowledge is cheap, which he says it doesn't have the value that it should have. And he claims that we must broaden the horizons. Broader and deeper, we must write our annals. From an ethical reformation, from an influx of the ever-new, ever-sanative conscience, if we would truly express our central and wide-related nature, instead of this old chronology of selfishness and pride to which we have too long lent our eyes. Already, that day exists for us, shines in on us unawares. But the path of science and letters is not the way into nature. And here comes the list of people who are going to bring us to an understanding of nature. The idiot, the Indian, the child, and the unschooled farmer's boy stand nearer to the light by which nature is to be read than the dissector or the antiquary. Move from the libraries, move from the universities, move into the woods, move to the farms, see the young, see the unschooled, understand, hear, grasp the pith of their language, sense the proximity that they have to the vital sources. This is going to be Emerson's legacy. And it is a legacy. This is Huckleberry Finn. This is what Twain is going to inherit. This is the idiot in The Sound and the Fury, Benjy Compson. Twain and Faulkner are going to find languages and they will find remarkable languages that will actualize the promise of Emerson's remarks. This is a proclamation here. This is a declaration of independence of a different sort. That's why I've called this the birth of American literature. It says that there is an American literature. That's a striking, stunning notion. Those people in the 19th century didn't think that. But it would be an idle claim if we didn't have a whole spate of masterpieces in American literature that actualize, that make good on, fully good on the promise and excitement of Emerson's theories. So he's a man to contend with. He has had his way. Thank you. This is lecture number 5, and in this second lecture on Emerson, I want to speak essentially about his probably most famous, most seminal essay called Self-Reliance. Now, self-reliance does not strike us as a particularly revolutionary notion. It's partly because of Emerson's success, it seems to me. He's helped us to see it as a kind of normal condition of life in this country. Also, I think it's fair to say that Emerson here is picking up a kind of confident, secular strain that we already see in the work of Benjamin Franklin. But what goes beyond Franklin and beyond any other writer is the way in which Emerson is going to convert this view of self-reliance into a religious creed. And that has particular point to it because we will see that all other religious authorities, moral authorities, social authorities, are going to be essentially banished. Self-reliance is going to be the great, soul-dominating, tyrannical creed for understanding how to behave and what life is about. So he's not simply saying you should rely also on yourself. He's saying you rely only on yourself. Reliance on anything else is misplaced. That's what the thrust of this essay is about, is to sort of show you what it means to rely on yourself, what kind of source that truly is. And one of the remarkable features of this essay is that it simply explodes, I think, our notion of what self is that we're relying on. Most of us think of self as essentially located within some sort of core of identity, of personhood. In Emerson, it weirdly becomes something that is outside us as well as inside us, some sort of large sort of stream or current or force that we tap into when we rely on ourselves. We, in a sense, join the rhythm of the universe. We become most sort of purely, authentically real. Now, there are a lot of politics connected with this, that the notion of the swollen self, many people regard as one of America's worst gifts to modern culture. We know the statistics about the amount of material goods that Americans consume vis-a-vis the world, etc. And there's no question that the notion of the empowered self takes a beating in a lot of ideological contexts, and I don't want to minimize that at all. And I think that Emerson's essay is not by any means something that we're always going to be comfortable with. But he does go the full route. And we will want to think about the charge of the imperialistic self as it might relate to Emerson's claims. So Emerson, I'm going to be suggesting, expands, challenges, sort of widens our optic on what it means to have a self. And he maps it out. He maps out the dimensions. It's like a new continent that comes into view when you read this essay. And I want to preface this lecture that way because I feel like self seems to us such a familiar concept. It's one that we think we know. In many ways, you might say it's the one thing that we think we know. But I don't believe that's the case when you really look at what Emerson has to say about it. The first thing he claims is that all great people have been self-reliant. That's what they have been. Familiar as the voice of the mind is to each, the highest merit that we ascribe to Moses, Plato, and Milton is that they set at naught books and traditions and spoke not what men, but what they thought. That everyone who achieves greatness, he fundamentally listens to the inner voice, fundamentally rejects, this is Emerson's view here, the outside voices of other texts, other traditions, other authorities. Now listen to this phrase here. In every work of genius, we recognize our own rejected thoughts. They come back to us with a certain alienated majesty. What an extraordinary remark that is. That when we read Shakespeare or Milton or Plato, we recapture something of ourselves. He uses the word rejected. Our own rejected thoughts. And he's thinking literally, etymologically, they've been sort of thrown from us. But their alienated majesty is now finally brought back home to us. We repossess our own estate through the encounter with great people. So that you've got to understand, Emerson's view of self is starting to become very capacious, very communal. Lots of folks are in there. They're all helping you to a sense of your own plenitude, a sense of your own reach, a sense of your own resources. It's really quite remarkable view of things. So that self, again, we ordinarily have too lazy, small a notion for it, some sort of inner private core. He's going to blow that sky high. He's saying that it's enormous, and that every time something outside comes into us, it helps us to see it and to expand it. That's how we possess the world. We recover ourselves in attending to genius. And so it won't surprise you that Emerson views all of us then as aristocrats. And this is an interesting line, given the kind of social issues and the very sort of virulent sense of democratic institutions that Emerson subscribes to. And he gives this little fable. The popular fable of the sot who was picked up dead drunk in the street, carried to the Duke's house, washed and dressed and laid in the Duke's bed, and on his waking treated with all obsequious ceremony like the Duke, and assured that he had been insane, owes its popularity to the fact that it symbolizes so well the state of man, who is in the world a sort of sot, but now and then wakes up, exercises his reason, and finds himself a true prince. So this is not some sort of exotic fable. This is the kind of aristocracy, majesty, richness that we are all heir to. And of course, self-reliance is going to be its strategy. Once again, it's an issue of tapping into power. The power that's there in the world that somehow we have blinded ourselves to. This self, then, is not in us, as I've said. It's enormous. He coins a beautiful phrase for it. He calls it the aboriginal self, on which a universal reliance may be founded. It's there. It's out there. It's in the world. We have to learn to move into it. And there are lots of interesting consequences that go here. How do we learn about this aboriginal self? Well, you don't learn about it through books. It's true that the encounter with Shakespeare or Plato may help you. But he makes a very sharp distinction here when he talks about spontaneity and instinct. We denote this primary wisdom, spontaneity and instinct, as intuition. That's a word we're all familiar with. But listen to the natural opposite of intuition. Whilst all later teachings are tuitions, intuition versus tuition. Now we think of tuition as a financial term, and it's what you have to pay to send your children to college. But he means tuition as everything that you learn versus everything that you, in a sense, tap into, move into, feel in your senses, in your mind, inside of you, not that you locate in libraries or in books. All later teachings are tuitions. Here again, you can imagine that the academy wouldn't be very comfortable with this man, because he's constantly saying that the true source of intelligence, wisdom, as well as behavior, is within. He also adds the line, and this is an astonishing line, perception is not whimsical, but fatal. Perception is not whimsical, but fatal. That what we see, what we feel, these are the very attributes of who we are. This is not guesswork. This is not accidental. This is what life has made us, and we better attend to it. We better know what our own machine is, what our own mannerisms are, our own rhythms, our own dance. Perception is fatal. How we look at the world is who we are. Now, I stress that because Emerson, in later essays, is going to begin to turn a corner on that sense of the primacy of individual perception. The self, then, is bonded to the world, and in one famous essay that is called the Oversoul, and the Oversoul is like that aboriginal self, it's that large sort of network, that large sort of reservoir that we are part of. He's going to define that reservoir very beautifully in the Oversoul. He's going to give it a very sort of biological definition. And this because the heart in thee is the heart of all. Not a valve, not a wall, not an intersection is there anywhere in nature. But one blood rolls uninterruptedly in endless circulation through all men, as the water of the globe is all one sea, and truly seen, its tide is one. Hemingway, and for whom the bell tolls, is going to pick up something of this notion and turn it into a kind of ethos. But here we have an almost biological, with the blood flowing, but almost ecological, in the sense that we're all sort of connected by some flowing system, view. And again, self would be essentially our connection to it. We think it's our private, single heart that pumps our blood. He's saying there's a larger bloodstream that we're all part of. Now, what are the consequences of this? Because they're amazing consequences. But they have to do with how you behave, what sort of rules you observe. And in a striking formulation, he quite simply inverts the entire Judeo-Christian ethos. No law can be sacred to me but that of my nature. Good and bad are but names very readily transferable to this or that. The only right is what is after my constitution. The only wrong is what is against it. Good and bad, bye-bye. Reject. They mean nothing. Every culture, every religion, every creed has redefined them. Simply jettison that tired dualism and say, here's the new one. Natural versus unnatural. Instinctive versus artificial. What feels right, what is after my nature, as he says, that is the new ethos. That's the new moral code. That's the only code. And what is alien to it is evil for me. You can imagine, again, how any institution of moral or spiritual values, whether it's the church or whether it's the government, is going to have a lot of problems with this kind of ecstatic celebration of instinct, of inner feeling, as the only operative code, the only one. So Emerson, as I say, there's something wonderful about the way he just goes the full route, and he gives us interesting views about how you achieve this. One of the things that he celebrates, for example, is nonchalance. And he suggests that children are, in a sense, the right models for us to follow. They don't worry themselves about dissecting moral issues. They are always, at least he thinks, sort of natural creatures who obey their instinct and move easily through the world and easily within their own circles. And he feels that we should perhaps imitate them. We should perhaps try to learn something of the virtues of nonchalance versus cultivation. It's also, as you can well imagine, the case that this is a deeply anti-social philosophy. The needs of others, the reality of outside codes, outside requirements, the very reality of the world, really gets sort of dismissed as irrelevant or as perhaps a nuisance, an annoyance. And Emerson can be really quite brutal, and we'll see the same is true for Thoreau. There's something very and antisocial in both of these men. Emerson. Men descend to meet. In their habitual and mean service to the world, for which they forsake their native nobleness, they They resemble those Arabian sheiks who dwell in mean houses and affect an external poverty to escape the rapacity of the pacha and reserve all their display of wealth for their interior and guarded retirements. It's a kind of interesting extended analogy that the sheiks who dressed the outsides of their houses meanly, simply, in a homely fashion, and kept all of their splendor and wealth on the inside for themselves, he says this is a figure of life. When we deal with others, when we meet others, we descend, we reduce. Our true riches and glamour and grandeur are inside. That's where it all exists. And so he does a lot of no-nos in terms of 19th century thinking, which is he rejects the notion of charity, he rejects the notion of being good to other people. Do not tell me, as a good man did today, of my obligation to put all poor men in good situations. Are they my poor? I tell thee, thou foolish philanthropist, that I grudge the dollar, the dime, the cent that I give to such men as do not belong to me and to whom I do not belong. Don't waste your time giving out your money. It's wasted money, wasted time. It's alien. It's not you. You're not enriching what counts here. He rejects what he calls the joint stock company view of society. And it's a view that you're going to see again when we come to Melville. Because people on board a ship really have reason to think that the world is a joint stock company and that they are intricately related to one another. But not so Emerson. This is all going to be simple. Now this model of self-reliance, needless to say, regards all imitation as mistaken. That you don't look at external models. The very famous line in Emerson is, insist on yourself, never imitate. Insist on yourself, never imitate. Now you may want to ask, is that possible? And in one of the most harrowing stories in the 19th century, Melville's tale of Bartleby, who was a copyist, Melville is playing with that, about can you in modern society avoid imitation? Modern society then being the society of the 1850s. But for Emerson,